counts beyond a reasonable doubt. And now that the poll has been entered and accepted by the judge, Donald Trump is a convicted felon, albeit we have to await sentencing because a conviction only becomes final when a sentence is entered.
So, Glenn, I'm going to get everybody up to speed. The jury has been polled. The jury foreperson spoke in a firm voice when he delivered guilty on all counts. Trump's demeanor, he's been looking down at the table. You can tell that Donald Trump is upset. Eric Trump looking angry. Alina Habba texting. Kind of not surprised, huh, Glenn? Trump has looked over at the jurors when they were confirming that it was their individual verdicts. Judge Merchan thanking the jurors for taking such a long time away from their families. After he polls the jurors, he tells them, and Glenn, this is an important thing I want you to talk about. Merchan tells the jurors, I want you to know the admonitions I gave you throughout the case no longer applies, talking about how you cannot talk about this case with your friends or family or with anybody. Merchan saying, you are now free to talk about this case. The choice is yours. Merchan saying, I'd like to meet with you in the jury room, please, to personally thank you. I'm not going to be permitted to discuss your deliberations, but I would like to get some feedback from you. And he's saying this to the jury, Glenn. I'd like to know what we did right and what we didn't do right, and what we could do differently. So, Glenn, the jury has now been excused. Now, I want to add a little bit of color from inside the courtroom, especially for our viewers that are tuning in. Every single juror, Glenn, had to walk in front of Donald Trump as they exited the jury box and they left the courtroom. So talk about what just happened with the thanking of the jury and the fact that they now can actually speak to the public if they want to.
Yeah, so a judge, in my experience, after every single trial, whether the trial results in a guilty verdict, a not guilty verdict, or if the jury can't reach unanimity and a mistrial is declared because they are hung, in every single case over the course of my career, the judge would thank the jurors for their service. This is a citizen-driven process, and it's not about the outcome. It's about the process, the fairness of the process, the integrity of the process. And jurors sacrifice mightily their personal lives, their usual course of their family business day to day. And it is a real sacrifice. I also believe it's not only a responsibility to serve if you are summoned to jury service, it's a privilege. Judges often tell jurors, this decision is far too important, far too consequential to leave to a bunch of government functionaries. That's why we entrust you, the citizens from the community in which the crime was allegedly committed, to decide the fate of one of your fellow community members. And
Glenn, I'm going to cut you off, Glenn, because I want you to talk about this. Right now, the jury's been gone. The jury left the courtroom. Now, Todd Blanche is up for Donald Trump, Glenn, arguing for a motion for an acquittal. Blanche arguing, there is no basis, Judge. There is no way that this jury could have reached a verdict. There is no reason that the court should allow this verdict knowing, and listen to this, Glenn, because you're going to get upset too. This makes me upset. There is no reason that the court should allow a verdict knowing that Michael Cohen committed perjury, suggesting to Judge Merchan that he allowed or he suborned perjury from the witness stand. Judge Merchan responding, I am sure that you misspoke, Mr. Blanche, when you said knowing Mr. Cohen was committing perjury. Blanche continues to say, there is no reason that the court should allow this verdict to stand. There was no evidence. There was no evidence that would support this verdict. Mr. Steinglass, the prosecution, saying, we, of course, disagree with Mr. Blanche's characterization of Michael Cohen's testimony. Judge Merchan saying, your motion is denied. Todd Blanche now asking Glenn, we'd like a date mid to late July for sentencing. The reason, are you ready, Glenn? The reason that Blanche tells Judge Merchan for a sentencing date mid to late July is, quote, President Trump faces other charges in other cases. There is a case in Florida, etc. And he talks about his Florida case, and the prosecution says, look, standard adjournment is 6 weeks. We don't oppose a date in mid-July. Sentencing date, Glenn, we now have July 11th for Donald Trump. Talk about that motion for acquittal and why it was, Trump is apparently not moving at all, just sitting there and just staring forward. Yeah, Glenn, I want to go back to that. motion for acquittal. Why was it denied, Glenn?
Because there was no basis for it. A jury just entered their verdict after sitting through a several-week-long trial, deliberating for a couple of days. They reached a decision that, Katie, I think you and I agree, was based on the evidence that was presented during the course of the trial. And this is a motion that the defense is entitled to make, a motion for a dismissal notwithstanding the verdict. These motions are virtually never denied, never granted. I think I've seen one granted in my years as a prosecutor, but I don't fault Todd Blanche for making it. I do fault him for suggesting that Judge Merchan knew something had gone wrong in the courtroom by way of Michael Cohen committing perjury. And I think that's why you heard Judge Merchan push back. Let me tell you, Katie, I'm a little surprised Judge Merchan didn't say, you know what? I'll order a briefing schedule. I'll give you a week to file your brief with your best arguments as why I should now override this jury's verdict. But you know what? I think Judge Merchan sent a message loud and clear, and it was within his judicial discretion to do so.
Yes.
I've seen the evidence. I've evaluated it. Denied.
So we got also this. Judge Merchan tells the parties, please file your motions no later than June 13th, which is 2 weeks from today. Judge Merchan asking the prosecution, what is the defendant's current bail status, which is interesting as well. Joshua Steinglass saying there is no bail. Obviously, we know that he's out on his own recognizance at 5:17 p.m. just 1 minute ago. Glenn Kirshner, former President Donald Trump, now, well, convicted, but we don't have an actual adjudication of guilt yet. But I am colloquially going to say, Glenn, convicted felon Donald Trump at 5:17 p.m. has now walked outside of the courtroom. I want to ask you, Glenn, do you think it's fair that somebody who's just been convicted of 34 felonies gets to walk out of a courtroom?
This is in essence a white collar crime. Now, I have railed my whole career against white collar criminals being treated unduly leniently as compared to, the folks who are snatching purses or selling rocks of crack, who have no means, no influence, and are unable to hire their own lawyers. We seem to treat them a whole lot more harshly. And I would argue that the white collar criminals, somebody like Donald Trump, who, let's face it, his 34 felonies did extreme damage to large swaths of the American population because he was trying to stack the deck criminally in his favor in a presidential election. At all that he will be on release pending sentencing. But now I think we have to look to the other jurisdictions where Donald.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a war. Think a war is coming? Civil war?
Committed the crime 10 times over of criminal contempt of court beyond a reasonable doubt. Judge Merchan found he had committed those crimes. Guess what? Those are violations of his pretrial release in his other cases. So I think we should be looking for show cause orders in his other cases.
Gotcha. And Glenn, we're going to bring in Tara Setmayer at this time. Tara, a historic moment and one that we don't celebrate because it never really should have gotten here in the first place, right? But I want to ask you what your thoughts are, top line, about the fact that the 45th president of the United States is now basically convicted felon.
Thanks for having me, Katie, on such a historic day. We really cannot understate the historic nature of this. As a country, we have never had a convicted felon former president. And I have to say, when I first heard the counts being read, I got emotional because I felt justice had finally been served. And this is the way the system is supposed to work. And it gave me faith that our institutions are still precious and valued and work. And this is a citizen-based system, right? American citizens sat through a trial, did their patriotic duty, and listened to the evidence. This wasn't Fox News or right-wing ecosystem propaganda being pumped into the courtroom, or conspiracy theories. This was cold, hard facts in a court of law where 18 jurors, if you include the alternates, listened intently, took notes, and made a determination. This is how it's supposed to work. And finally, finally, after decades and decades of Donald Trump engaging in all kinds of illicit and unethical behavior, justice was served today on May 30th, 2024. Now let's go get him on the rest of the charges.
I was going to say, Tara, I also wanted to follow up and say the sentencing, it looks like, is going to be 4 or 5 days before the RNC. So talk about whether or not you think that's going to actually have any type of impact when he goes to the RNC.
So you know what? I think it's not going to have any impact necessarily on the cult, right? The cult is the cult. That's why it's a cult. But where it will have an impact, and we have seen polling that shows this, is for those, now I think it's up to about 20% of Republicans who are uncomfortable with Donald Trump. They were looking for an alternative. These are the Nikki Haley voters, the undecideds in the Republican Party. This is going to matter. Because no matter how much Donald Trump screams, whines, complains, truth socials his little thumbs till they fall off, he can never erase the fact that his name will be associated with being a convicted felon. He is a convicted felon. This does not change, unless obviously it's overturned, but that won't happen before the election. So I think that at the RNC, we're going to hear, unfortunately, a lot of attacks on the Justice Department and on the justice system and how unfair it is. We've seen a preview of this based on the way that the Republicans who traipsed up to the courthouse to support Donald Trump through this hearing, that gave us a preview as to how the Republicans are going to handle it and spin it, that it was unfair, that it was stacked against him, all those things. But for reasonable people who are not in the cult, who are watching what's going on here,
clear the streets tonight.
They have an issue with the fact that they could possibly have the next president be a convicted felon. That bothers some people in this country. And I think that we cannot understate the importance of making sure everyone is reminded that Donald Trump is a convicted felon.
So, Tara, Donald Trump came out of the courtroom, says it was a rigged decision, quote, "This country is going to hell." We're going to get the actual verbate, the word for word verbate, but that is the quote part is, "This country is going to hell." Your reaction to Donald Trump's reaction to this? He's got to be pissed off, huh?
Oh, predictable. I believe that there was reports that just shortly before I came on that he just sat there and stared forward in the courtroom. Of course he's going to say this. What else is he going to say? He doesn't take responsibility for anything. And the difference though about this is that he can't really tell people that you can't believe your lying eyes or your lying ears.
Exactly.
Or this is a court of law. And either you believe in our court system or you don't. This isn't the media. This isn't a talk show. This is a court of law. And so he's going to use all the terms. We're going to hear all the same things over and over again because he has a limited vocabulary. So we'll hear the same things over and over again. But it's not going to change the result. So I think we're going to see Donald Trump have a freak out for the next couple of days. And I can only imagine what his next rally is going to look like. But that doesn't help him in a court of law. That doesn't change the result. But what it does do is it gives another tool for the Democrats to use when they make the case to the American people that you have a binary choice. It's
literally. See if I can get some footage of him.
Has the Biden campaign engaged at all on the news just moments ago that the former president, for the first time in history, has been found guilty on 34 felony counts?
David, we are still awaiting any kind of official response from the campaign, though our team has heard that there were cheers inside the Biden headquarters in Wilmington as the verdict was read. Look, President Biden has been very careful in the last weeks not to comment on this trial. That, I have been told, will now change now that we have a verdict. Obviously, these guilty verdicts are a political gift to Democrats, a political gift to the president. He is now running against a convicted felon. But don't expect the president to completely upend his campaign messaging because of this, I am told. This verdict is not now going to somehow become the centerpiece of his messaging to the American people. The Biden team is very well aware of former President Trump's argument, as we just heard, his claims that this is all somehow rigged. The president doesn't want to be overly celebratory and feed in to that narrative that this was somehow a witch hunt concocted by President Biden. He has been adamant that he had nothing to do with this. He has said that he has never had a single conversation with anyone in his administration, with the Justice Department, anyone about Donald Trump's legal troubles. What you can expect the president do, though, is to continue to argue that Donald Trump, he believes, is unfit to serve, and he will make the argument that ultimately it is up to voters to decide Donald Trump's future, because as we have been noted, even if he does face any kind of prison time, that is likely, unlikely, but even if it does happen, not likely to happen, certainly before an election. And so the president is going to make the argument that this ultimately comes down to the ballot.
With just a few seconds here, Mary, before I turn back to our courtroom reporters, President Biden has very rarely even addressed the fact that this criminal trial was taking place. At times, you would report that he would say something along the lines of his opponent is tied up today, a sort of nod to a nudge, if you will, to the Trump campaign about what was playing out here in New York City. But other than that, there has been very little said about this criminal trial.
Yeah, he would subtly needle his opponent over this, right? We all recall when he had challenged him to that debate saying, I hear you're free on Wednesdays, which was the day that obviously court was not in session. But beyond that sort of subtle jabbing and not so subtle sort of jokes, you didn't hear the president really comment on the substance much, because he wanted to keep his distance, because he didn't want to feed into that narrative that Trump and his supporters have been pushing, that this is all a political hit job. The president is going to react to this, I am told. The question is how he does it, in what form, and how, fiercely and forcefully he now brings this up on the campaign trail going forward. Just how much will Donald Trump, being a convicted felon, play a role? How much of a role will it play in the president's campaign speeches going forward? We are going to wait and see. Forgive me for constantly looking at my phone here, David, because we are expecting hopefully some kind of reaction from the campaign very soon. Stand by. It has actually just landed in our inbox. So if you bear with me here while I read this, this is a statement from the campaign communication director saying, in New York today, we saw that no one is above the law. Donald Trump has always mistakenly believed he would never face consequences for breaking the law for his own personal gain. But today's verdict does not change the fact that the American people face a simple reality. There is still only one way to keep Donald Trump out of the Oval Office, at the ballot box. Convicted felon or not, Trump will be the Republican nominee for president. He goes on to say that Trump poses to the threat that Trump poses to our democracy has never been greater. He says he is running an increasingly unhinged campaign of revenge and retribution, pledging to be a dictator on day one, calling for the Constitution to be terminated so he can regain and keep power. The statement concludes by saying a second Trump term means chaos, ripping away Americans' freedoms and fomenting political violence, and the American people will reject it this November. That is the official statement from the Biden-Harris campaign spokesman, David.
Mary Bruce, with reaction just coming in from the Biden campaign. Olivia Rubin, our courtroom reporter, part of our investigative unit here at ABC News. Olivia, you were in the courtroom and in that overflow room so many days during this trial. Can you describe what you witnessed late this afternoon as the jury was called back into that courtroom and the verdict was read, the reaction from the former president in that room?
Well, for the most part, David, a stone-faced Donald Trump in that courtroom, almost motionless the entire time. He sat in his seat, slumped back, the frown we have seen on his face almost every single day inside of that courtroom. And it was no different for most part when he heard the jury read that verdict. But it's so striking, David, because I want to rewind for just a moment, because before the verdict came in, Judge Merchan had called the parties in to tell them essentially that the day was about to be over. Donald Trump thought that he was going home without a verdict today. He just had about 15 minutes to kill. And what we saw was a Donald Trump at that verdict, at the defense table, that we have never seen before. He was joking, he was laughing, he was smiling with Todd Blanche. They were chatting, they were laughing almost incessantly. Todd Blanche laughing so hard at one point, doubling over that his forehead almost touched the table in front of him. They thought that they were going home today. It seemed without a verdict. It was almost a jubilant, giddy Donald Trump, but that changed very, very quickly when Judge Merchan came back into the room to inform the parties that the jury had reached that verdict. And then, of course, it shifted to that original Donald Trump that I just described to you. And something that we noticed, the whole team that has been in there for 7 weeks throughout this case, is how little the jury looked at Donald Trump when they would come in and out of that courtroom every single day. They have to march right by him, just inches away from him, and they hardly ever looked at him courtroom, David, they looked down at the floor, and it was essentially the same story today. And such a striking scene today to see the jury leave in front of Donald Trump, again, just inches away from him after rendering that guilty verdict, marching in front of him in the line that they have done day in and day out, and again, appearing to look down at the floor once again. But Donald Trump, on that camera that's on him in the overflow room, he was looking at them. He stood in front of them as they passed. He adjusted his tie. So really just a remarkable moment from him, from that jubilant, laughing, giddy Donald Trump, who thought he was going home today with no verdict, to the man sitting at the defense table as they are saying guilty over and over and over again, a convicted felon, David.
Olivia, stay with us here as we're looking at live pictures here from WABC Channel 7 here in New York, our ABC station, obviously trained over the courthouse. We're expecting to see the former president leave the courthouse at any moment. And as Olivia just described, the final moments inside that courtroom today, the judge had indicated that perhaps the jurors would be headed home for the day, that this would go into a third day of deliberations. Olivia describing
what's MAGA gonna do,
a
man?
former president and his defense attorney, his main defense
I want to
attorney,
know
Todd
what the
Blanche,
MAGA crew gonna do.
laughing with one another, smiling with each other. And then a stark shift in temperature at that defense table when the judge then moments later said the jury had in fact reached a verdict in this case. And Olivia, as we know, the defense believed that with every day that went by, that was a more positive sign for them. So I would gather at the end of today, late today, when they thought this was going to bleed into a third day of deliberations, there was some relief that we're going to go into another day. And in fact, moments later, that dramatic sort of whiplash moment in the courtroom.
That's right. And I do think what you touched on right there, referring to Todd Blanche and how sort of critical he was to this case and what
the MAGA boys
he did
and
for
girls
Donald
gonna
Trump
do.
over the past few weeks is so interesting to sort of laser in on, and to watch Todd Blanche in the courtroom today was so fascinating. You could feel the intensity from him because this was his moment, this was his case, and he was performing essentially in front of Donald Trump every single day. And what was so fascinating as they are waiting for this verdict to come down, because remember, they had a 30-minute waiting period where they had to sit at the defense table and wait for the verdict. You could see him gripping the tie around his neck, loosening it, the pressure clearly weighing on him. And there were times when all of them sat there really not speaking at all. Again, that 30-minute waiting period so telling. The prosecutors just feet away from them to their right-hand side, also really saying nothing at all. And then, of course, Alvin Bragg, just a few benches behind them. He had been in the courtroom just a few days, and what was so fascinating about him is how sort of you could feel his intensity in the courtroom as well, at times hunched over papers in his lap. I think at one point I saw him following along with questioning of witnesses, and you could see his tension. He was hunched over his papers once again, furiously taking notes at one point. So really the stakes that were on all parties here. But again, bringing it back to Todd Blanche, this was his case for Donald Trump. He had been front and center. He had done the cross-examination of Michael Cohen. And then when he spoke, David, just one last point, when he spoke to make that motion with Judge Merchan at the end, after the verdict had already been rendered, you could quite literally hear the nervousness and the fluster in his voice as he was speaking to Merchan. He was tripping over his words. He was speaking slowly. He was speaking quietly. And it was just so apparent that the verdict that had just come down was weighing on him as much as it was his client, again, Donald Trump, who remained seated at that defense table before, adjusting his jacket one last time to leave that courtroom. So again, just tension for all parties there.
This is just extraordinary color from inside that courtroom. Olivia, stay with us here. A few more questions for you as we also keep our eyes trained on these helicopter shots from Channel 7 here in New York as we await the former president leaving that courthouse. You can see Secret Service assembled. Olivia talking about Alvin Bragg, and for those of you at home who've been following, you certainly know who he is, but we'll bring everybody up to speed. The Manhattan district attorney who brought the case but was not in that courtroom every day, and in fact, his team of prosecutors instead making the arguments. Obviously, Josh Steinglass delivering the closing arguments in this case. Some had wondered if perhaps the closing arguments were too long, particularly from the prosecution. The defense closing was long as well. But there were those who wondered if Mr. Steinglass had gone on too long. I'm certainly of the belief now that he's happy with what he said because he got the verdict that he was looking for. There will be a lot of sort of Monday morning quarterbacking, really, particularly for the defense at this point. Todd Blanche, a respected defense attorney, but there have been questions about the approach during this trial and whether or not it was the right approach in trying to defend the former president against these particular counts.
I want to hear
I want to get back to Olivia, though, because, again, in New York, no cameras in the court for this trial. And Olivia, you were describing the jurors, and I want to laser in on this because as we heard from Judge Juan Merchan, in his instructions to the jury, he told them, you are deciding the fate of a fellow member of this community, so as to take down the temperature of the moment, the history of the moment, that they know full well this was the former president sitting there before them at the defense table, but also instructing each of those jurors not to allow bias, their own political beliefs to enter into the equation, that they need to find him guilty or not guilty based on the totality of the evidence. And what I mean by that is, in particular, he said, you cannot come up with a verdict here based solely on the testimony of Michael Cohen. There must be corroborating evidence that you've seen in this case in coming up with your decision. For those joining us now, obviously, you know, 34 counts, all 34 counts the former president found guilty of in a Manhattan courtroom here late this afternoon. And Olivia, it would seem those jurors took those instructions to heart, particularly when you talk about the dynamic or lack thereof between those jurors and the former president as they left that courtroom. Again, describe the eye contact the former president was making with them versus the other direction.
Well, I will say, you talk about, you know, the focus of the jury day in and day out inside of the courtroom, David. It is hard to underscore.
Does anybody think he's going to spend a day in prison? Let me know. Who thinks he's going to spend any time in prison? I don't think so.
We know were marathon. They paid attention and took notes during a 5-hour closing argument. That is remarkable. They listened to Todd Blanche. I noticed one juror nodding their head and taking notes as Todd Blanche was delivering his closing. So it appeared to be a jury that was listening so intently to both sides. Though I will also point out, this was not a very expressive jury. They did not give a lot with their facial expressions, with their motions throughout the 20-plus days that they sat through this trial, and that we watched them every single day. But what was so apparent, as I hinted at earlier, was how they just never looked at Donald Trump. It was so rare, although there was one or two jurors that occasionally would look at him when they would go in and out of the courtroom. And that was one of sort of the most remarkable, logistical setups of the courtroom. Every single time that the jury came in for the day, Donald Trump would stand and they would emerge from the left side of the courtroom, a little door, and they would file in a line past Donald Trump across the courtroom and into the jury box where they would take their seats. So for just those 4 or 5 seconds, twice every single day, they were just inches away from the former president and the man whose fate they would ultimately decide. And again, it was so striking how not only would they not look at him, but they would look down at the floor most of the time as they made their way past him, or some of them would try to sort of conveniently turn their neck so that they were facing the other way and trying to look over where Judge Merchan would sit, but really doing anything that they could to not stand in his direction as Donald Trump stood sort of shoulders back tall in his suit in front of them, some of them wearing sneakers, some of them wearing T-shirts occasionally, a really striking dynamic.
Bring your ass
and then,
outside.
of course, today, again, with the camera on Donald Trump, watching him watch the 12 jurors who
Bring your
just
ass
decided his
outside,
fate
Trump.
walk out, and yet again, they don't even appear to acknowledge him. And you have, you know, the former leader of the free world, the man who could become president yet again if he is successful, adjusting his suit, adjusting his tie, and sort of slumped over in front of the 12 average New Yorkers who just decided for him and are barely once again even looking at him. David.
Olivia, thank you so much. Stay with us here for our live coverage. We'll come back to you shortly. Olivia Rubin, just one of our team of reporters inside that courthouse throughout the duration of this trial. And as you know at home from our reporting over the course of several nights on this, that it really does come down to the eyes and ears of the reporters in that courthouse to help us get a fuller picture of the dynamic at play. We're getting Republican reaction coming in. We'll get to that in just a moment. But just to add to what Olivia just said, as we await live pictures here, we expect to see perhaps the former president leaving that courthouse. You can see the security arranged outside the courthouse, Secret Service certainly. They had prepared for this moment, no matter what the outcome would be from this jury.
Some of the MAGA
we
folks,
know
man,
that
crying.
the jurors, and this comes from our team inside the courthouse, in addition to Olivia, jurors showing no facial emotions, nodding along with Judge Merchan as he thanked them for their service. He asked them for feedback about the entire process in the future. He said to them, "You are excused with the gratitude of the court." And while he was saying that to the jurors, the defense attorney, Todd Blanche, sitting with his head in his hands at the defense table, his elbows on the table, rubbing his lips, Judge Juan Merchan thanking the jurors for handling a, quote, very stressful and difficult task. And as we heard Olivia Rubin report there, with the exception of looking at the former president now and then as they entered the courtroom day to day, there was very little exchange as far as making eye contact with the former president, the person whose fate was in their hands, although we do know from today's reporting that the former president was studying each one of those jurors, particularly as they were polled individually after this verdict today, each one of them saying yes when asked, "Is this your verdict?" Former President Trump found guilty on 34 felony counts in New York City late today. Rachel Scott, who covers Capitol Hill, who covers the race for president, getting first reaction here on the Republican side. I understand Speaker Johnson has reacted in addition to others.
Yes, David, this reaction from the Republican Party is coming in very quickly. The Speaker of the House issuing a statement calling today a shameful day in American history, calling this purely a political exercise, not a legal one. We're also hearing from several Republican senators, Senator Marco Rubio, calling this a complete travesty, Senator John Cornyn, calling this verdict a disgrace. Even Trump's former rivals who ran against him in the Republican primary, including Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, calling this all political, saying this was an effort to
stand by because we're watching these live pictures of the former president entering the SUV there in the foreground of your screen. Sorry to interrupt, but let's just watch this scene as it plays out. We'll come back to you for Republican reaction. We also have reaction coming in from members of the Trump family. We know inside that courtroom today, Eric Trump, Donald Trump's son, throughout the course of this trial, he has been there, not necessarily every day, but has often been there. We have seen Don Jr., we've seen Tiffany Trump. Notably absent from the trial itself, Melania Trump and Ivanka Trump. John Santucci, who is watching this picture right along with us here, an extraordinary sight, and you're hearing reaction from the Trump family, in particular Don Jr.?
Yeah, Donald Trump Jr. being one of the first family members to react to this, David, telling ABC News that, you know, Democrats got what they wanted here. You know, of course, they have hyped on the fact that New York is a state run by Democrats. Of course, as we know, you mentioned earlier in your conversation with Dan Abrams that, of course, Donald Trump is no longer a New York resident. All of Donald Trump's children, his 3 adult children in particular, who all lived in Manhattan at one point, now reside, of course, in Florida with their father. And Donald Trump Jr., David, telling me that same sentiment that his father echoed in front of the cameras on the 15th floor of that Manhattan courthouse, that voters will now weigh in. Voters will decide this election in November, and that will be the real result and outcome that they will, of course, will look forward towards.
John, you know that the Trump family, Donald Trump, watches those polls every single day. He has talked about it as he has left the courtroom in New York under that partial gag order, unable to talk certainly about any witnesses on the stand, but would talk in generic terms about the proceedings of the day, but then would pivot politically to the race for president, obviously. They're very aware of where the race stands. The national polling shows President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump really within a point or two of each other on any given day when these national polls come out. Where Donald Trump has taken note, and I'm certainly sure that you have heard this from inside the Trump campaign, is in the battleground states where we know in the Electoral College these presidential races are decided, and that in several of the key battlegrounds, Donald Trump in recent weeks has shown some steady but very slow movement in what they would believe is the right direction, expanding by a point or two his lead over President Biden in some of these key battlegrounds. And they must be wondering, given what John Carl reported earlier and what our polling and others who have polled this question of independent voters and those who are on the fence, whether or not a felony conviction would change their minds, whether or not this has any impact on numbers that are already extraordinarily close.
Well, David, you mentioned the last several weeks the polls have been doing a bit better. It's also been the last several weeks that they can't capitalize on that because, as you well know, this was the first time in Donald Trump's life his schedule was out of his hands. He, of course, was stuck in that Manhattan courtroom. Recall, David, that he needed Judge Juan Merchan's approval to go to his son's high school graduation. So they know that this is now a tough situation. And look, David, all the reaction that I've been getting, Rachel, our colleague Catherine Falders as well, has been not surprised. It's New York. But let's be clear, this is not the verdict they wanted. So they can say they're not surprised by it, but it is something they now know they need to double down and pivot. One of the things, I know Rachel has heard this, as have I, that they are hoping is that they can quickly now get back to the campaign and move things forward. And one of the things that senior advisors to Donald Trump have been trying to get the former president to focus on is a running mate. Donald Trump has not engaged in conversations. Of course, names have popped up, names have been floated out there, many of whom have gone on and done what previous people have wanted to be Donald Trump's running mate have done, which is defend him on camera, or in this case, which is interesting, right? Think about 2016 versus 2024. 2016 was who was on TV talking and saying nice things about me. 2024 has become who's coming to court with me. And we have seen many potential individuals, senators, governors, attorney generals who want to be in a Donald Trump round 2 White House go with him, David, to court, as we have seen in real time. So that's one of the things that advisors are hoping, if they can quickly pivot, quickly get out of New York, literally get Donald Trump out of New York and back onto the campaign trail, getting ahead with a Veep nominee, getting ahead with the RNC, moving into debates, quickly getting away from this conversation. And that's going to be hard, David, because look, as our team has noted, and we've already seen it, Donald Trump knows in some ways these cases, though with independents are not good with him, his base, it has helped. We've already seen fundraising emails fired out the second the verdict was released. Of course, Donald Trump knows that he's got to find a way to shore up support, and with.
John Santucci reporting with us here this afternoon on the guilty verdict, unanimous, all 34 counts, felony counts. The jury finding the former president guilty. As we look at this live picture, John, I just want to ask you, because we're watching, and there have been so many of these moments, but we'll stick with this one here as we watch the motorcade, the SUV, the Secret Service guide the former president back up to Trump Tower, obviously from Lower Manhattan, where the courthouse is, up the east side of Manhattan right here. And even though we have heard the former president repeatedly talk about, you know, his belief that this is rigged and political, we know, first of all, for a fact that the jury that was seated, both sides agreed to, that they come from various walks of life. And we also know that Donald Trump was a born and bred New Yorker. His father had a very successful real estate business here, a branding empire between father and son. Donald Trump enjoyed many, many years sort of being at the top in New York City. And to be in this SUV now, guided by the Secret Service back up to Trump Tower after being found guilty on 34 felony counts, even though he says it's political, expresses disgust for what played out here in New York City today. This is a man who called himself a New Yorker for decades and who enjoyed significant success here.
It's an unbelievable story. A guy that was made by New Bridge to the island of Manhattan that was Donald Trump's goal. Donald Trump told voters in 2015 and 16 that I live in the most famous address ever, the most prized possession on Fifth Avenue. He loved living in New York, being a part of New York. You know, even in the last couple of days, David, I had heard from many senior aides and longtime friends to Donald Trump that he actually liked being in Trump Tower the last couple of weeks. Keep in mind, David, that was his residence for decades. He took such great pride and joy in it. I mean, many people have told this story. I experienced it myself the first time I went into Trump Tower, that Donald Trump loved to show off the views. Look at the Plaza Hotel. Look at Central Park. This was Donald Trump's pride and joy as a New Yorker. And to think that this is a city that he really spent his life trying to be a part of, breaking into. You know, as we're watching this helicopter follow his motorcade, I'm reminded of a video in our ABC archives of Barbara Walters with Donald Trump, talking about how he wanted to make the New York skyline different, put his impact on it. He's driving along right now, David. You got to imagine looking in part out the window, looking at the city that he had a big part of in some ways for many, many years. And this is a city now, David, that has left a very different impression on Donald Trump. And I mentioned earlier, but just think about it, right? You know, we all grow up, we all move away from home, life brings us in different places. But Donald Trump left New York because of a new job that he became president, but then left in protest because of these cases, because of these prosecutors that he said were out to get him. His children followed. His entire being in New York is no longer there. It's such a different life. As one person said to me when this case got started, think of everything Donald Trump had in 2015 before his foot stepped on the escalator. It's a lot of a different life now.
Certainly is a new chapter for Donald Trump in New York City, a city that made him, and as John said moments ago, today, a city that has profoundly impacted where things go from here, though whether or not this affects the outcome in November certainly is an open-ended question. You heard John Carl and Rachel Scott talk about fundraising.
Trump motorcade as it presumably heads uptown to Trump Tower moments after, if you're just tuning in, the former president was found guilty. A sweeping verdict from a jury here in Manhattan, 34 counts of falsification of business records, a felony because the jury found it was in pursuit of promoting an election by unlawful means. And those unlawful means, Danny, are likely the fertilest ground for this appeal because, as we have explained this morning, the jury had to find that there was this unlawful means, but they didn't have to agree on what exactly it was that the former president did wrong. So how do you mount an appeal on that when they were given an assortment of laws that they could have said that there were violations of, but we don't know which ones they relied on? It's not in the court record. It wasn't on the verdict form.
I expect a challenge that the statute is what's called unconstitutionally vague. Now, it's presumed that we all know the law. It's a legal fiction, but the key is the law must prescribe certain conduct. It must say, thou shalt not do something in a way that members of the public can understand, whether or not they've actually read them, because it's presumed that we've all read the law, which obviously we haven't. But it has to be able to tell us with some certainty what is prohibited and what is permitted. And the argument I believe we'll see on appeal is that this statute is unconstitutionally vague because it does not tell us specifically, what does not tell a defendant like Trump or any defendant what exactly was prohibited. And then also, it may create a burden of proof issue, the statute itself. Again, nothing to do with Justice Merchan, but the actual statute as written may create due process issues, burden of proof issues. All of those are fertile grounds for appeal. And then if you go back to the facts, I guess I would put as number 2, maybe elements of testimony of Stormy Daniels, which at the time Justice Merchan himself said raised some concerns. In fact, the real problem was the defense didn't appear to object when Justice Merchan, it seems, thought they should have.
We're looking at the motorcade right now, and you'll note they've hit some traffic. Unlike a presidential motorcade, which could be 20 or 30 vehicles, this is very short for a
You think this hurts them in the polls, y'all?
And dealing with
I think the people that's still mad at Biden still going to be mad at Biden. I don't think they care either way. I know I don't.
He may want to get out of town, and he's certainly able to do that as he remains out on bond on his own recognizance. On that appeal issue, Lindsey Graham, who's, of course, the senator, a Trump ally, and an attorney himself, says he believes this will be reversed on appeal. But just to be clear about that, even if it were, if you win your appeal, you just get another trial. That's if the prosecutors choose to refile charges.
Yes, if your conviction is vacated and the case is remanded back for trial, then yes, a new trial is the next step. But sometimes appellate courts will reverse a conviction and then set the person free. It really depends on what is appealed and what the standard of review is for each ground for appeal.
All right, we want to look what's happening behind the scenes at the courthouse itself. Dasha Burns has been there. Dasha, you were with us as people were crowding in on word that there had been a decision. What's it like now?
Well, Lester, members of the public have been filtering in and out of this park over the last hour or so. People really on all sides of this issue, members of the media as well. We've seen, I think, in fact, over here, some of the folks that are on different sides of this, a supporter of the former president and someone who did believe that he should be found guilty in this case. They've gotten into some clashes, but nothing outrageous. There are police officers here. Some people certainly getting passionate, though, because this is obviously a historic moment. I've been talking to some of the supporters of the former president who really have echoed what we've heard from Hallie and from some of the folks in the studio, that they feel like this is only going to solidify and harden and amplify the support for the former president because they've been listening to what he's been putting out there, what his team has been putting out there. It is a pretty calm scene. I'll tell you, we did hear those cheers and those boos when we first heard the verdict, but otherwise people have been here. They've been discussing this really important moment, a few arguments, some debates, but mostly everyone is just taking in what we have just seen, what we've just experienced, and asking a lot of questions about what exactly is next here. There are more folks having sort of a debate here. This is the First Amendment rights that people are demonstrating right now. They are allowed to be here. They're allowed to make their voices heard. And again, people on all sides of this issue. We've met folks from Long Island, from New Jersey, from the Bronx, from all across the tri-state area that came here to witness all of this, Lester.
And one of the names that has loomed so large in this trial, and Michael Cohen.
Yeah.
We haven't talked about him much here this afternoon. Are we hearing from him?
We are, just in the last few minutes here. He, of course, was the prosecution's star witness, somebody who, of course, has lied and has acknowledged lying. The defense, boy, did they target him repeatedly throughout this trial, including in closing arguments, essentially saying to the jury, how can you believe anything that Michael Cohen says? This guy just doesn't tell the truth. Cohen now says today is an important day for accountability and the rule of law. He says, well, it's been a difficult journey for me and my family. The truth always matters. He goes on to thank his attorneys for their advice and support. One of the things that prosecutors tried to do in their questioning of Michael Cohen was try to draw out, it seemed, try to elicit some empathy from the jurors to what Cohen has gone through. He talked a bit about how this process, testifying against the guy who used to be his boss, somebody who he says he was incredibly close to, was his so-called fixer for many years, how this has been incredibly difficult on his family, on him, on his personal life.
They justified some of his anger.
Yeah, they tried to sort of make that case to the jury. The defense obviously tried to poke holes in it, but it is notable that we're hearing from Cohen tonight.
To say say he was a fraught witness is an understatement
100%.
because he had lied, admittedly, repeatedly to Congress, to federal court, to prosecutors. To his
I know the
family,
media
to
is
Donald
set up
Trump. He
and
was
they
caught
know
on the
exactly
stand
where he's
acknowledging
going.
that
So
he
I'm
had
quite sure
stolen
they
from his
waiting for him to
former
get there so they
boss.
can ask
The
for questions. I
prosecutors
know
were
he
trying to
might have something to
rehabilitate him
say.
and say, well, yes,
That's
he
what I'm
was
waiting
a
on.
liar, but it was always in service of Donald Trump. And now he's here to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Very interesting. By their verdict, Danny, the jury says, we believe you, Michael Cohen.
Yes, and let's take a step back. Yes, Michael Cohen had credibility issues, but prosecutors often use cooperating witnesses, and Michael Cohen was a cooperating type witness, who have much worse credibility issues. Some of these cooperating witnesses are killers. They're people who deal in guns, in drugs. They have lengthy criminal histories, much longer than Michael Cohen. So the reason that prosecutors use people like Michael Cohen, cooperating witness types, is because they work. They are devastatingly effective. I can tell you from having gone up against them myself. And you can point out that they are liars over and over again. But on the whole, a jury is willing to accept someone's faults, someone who comes in and testifies. And the prosecution will usually own it, just as they did in this case. Not only did they own it, they had no problem throughout their case in chief with Michael Cohen being hit with credibility shrapnel throughout. He was painted by their own witnesses as a sometimes tragic, sometimes bumbling figure, but they always owned that he had credibility issues, and they had to do that.
Yeah, and the prosecutors would say, we didn't choose Michael Cohen. We didn't go to the witness store and pick him up for a low, low price. It's Donald Trump who chose Michael Cohen as his lawyer and fixer, and that is his relevance to the case. We have Jen Psaki with us now, of course, former press secretary at the White House for President Biden. So we've talked a lot about what the potential political ramifications are of a conviction, and we are in uncharted territory. So I think, honestly, some humility here, because nobody knows. We've never had a convicted felon as a former president or as a candidate for federal office. But how do you believe the Biden administration, the Biden campaign will be handling this, and how do you think they should?
Well, you can already see from the last hour or so how they're starting to handle it. And one is the White House had a very short, minimal statement that basically referred to believing in the rule of law. The campaign had a much longer statement. One of the key lines in that campaign statement was about how the only way to ensure Donald Trump is not in the Oval Office is the ballot box, which what that tells you is that they are not relying on this conviction, Trump going to jail, or whatever the sentencing will be, which we won't know for some time either, as the way to get rid of Donald Trump, to prevent him from being in the Oval Office. I think the challenge, if you're in the White House right now, is a couple things. You want to try to control the White House team and staff and people who work there to prevent people from celebrating. This is not a time to celebrate. As you said, this is a very serious moment. This is a jury of the former president's peers who just convicted him of crimes on 34 counts. I mean, this is a serious moment. No cheering, no celebrating. Treat it with the seriousness that it warrants. On the campaign, they also have to manage that. What's tricky is they're going to fundraise off of this.
They already are.
They already are. So they're going to fundraise off of it, but I think it's going to be a balance for them. They're not betting on this as being a factor because, as you said, we don't know. We don't know. We see what polls have said, but polls have even said it's a very small number of Republicans this could move. But my bet is they're not betting on this. They're betting on the ability to turn the conversation to other things which they want to do.
Well, good for the goose and is good for the gander. The Biden campaign's fundraising off it. So is Donald Trump. He's got a post out where he has his image and it says political prisoner.
That's right. It's at least I believe the Democratic campaign arm fundraising off of this at this point.
I think the campaign probably will too. I think we should expect that.